Why does nothing work in our society today? Why does it take so long for government programs to get running? Why does it take so long for the private sector to build housing? Why does nothing seem to be getting done? Marc Dunkelman is a fellow at the Watson Institute at Brown University, and he's the author of the new book, Why Nothing Works. And he joins the podcast today to talk about his book. And we talk about ideas like the centralization of power, how the progressive movement has at times advocated for more centralization of power and at times distrusted power and believed that we need more guardrails around power. We talk about the specifics of how this impacts our environmental policy, our infrastructure, our housing. And we talk about whether or not, in the end, what we're seeing from Donald Trump and Elon Musk is the sins of the Democratic Party coming back to haunt us. I think it's an amazing conversation, and I hope you'll stick around. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Marc Dunkelman. Marc, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so this book that we're talking about today, Why Nothing Works, is it's a very interesting addition to what I'll call like the abundance movement. And there's a lot of names that this has. Some people have called it, supply side liberalism or the abundance agenda or, liberalism that builds. There's a lot of names. There's a lot of people out there who are eager to see the government become better at what it's doing and society to get better at building things. And this is a conversation that's been happening for several years now across different sectors of policy. And your book really introduces an angle to this that I find fascinating, where one of the things you think is really important historically here is the progressive balance between, do we want to centralize power to accomplish big things and kind of an FDR style centralization of power, let's just, rip it and go kind of attitude? Or do we want to decentralize power? Do we distrust authority? Do we want to protect people from the arbitrary and capricious nature of giant, powerful institutions, and therefore we want power to be very diffuse and not concentrated in the hands of only a few people? Can we talk about that? Can you give me kind of the basic thesis of how this dynamic has essentially screwed up the workings of our government in hundreds of different ways?
So you're exactly right that the core idea in my book is that progressivism, as it's generally understood, is misunderstood. The movement from its very founding in the late 19th century has been this awkward marriage of two very different impulses. And the first, which I call Hamiltonian, is one in which you see some tragedy of the common, some problem that everyone faces that no one can solve on their own. And you say to yourself, the only way to solve this is to install power in some bureaucracy that's above us. So the whole neighborhood doesn't have a sewage system. You need to give power to some bureaucracy that's going to choose where the pipes are going to go and lay the pipes and put the pipes connected to each house and building, right? There's a situation where progressives saw this at that time in all sorts of realms. They didn't have a good recreation system, good park system, good school system, good transportation system, in all these realms of life in America at the turn of the 19th century, or I should say of the 20th century. In all these ways at the turn of the 20th century, the problems of American life were problems born from a lack of centralized authority. And progressivism emerged in large part to address that, to say, all right, now we're going to install power in a school board that's going to be able to hire teachers, or we're going to install power in a sanitation department or in City Hall, or you name it. And generally those were supposed to be experts, and they were going to do for the public what the public could not do for itself.
I know that even at the turn of, I forget exactly what time period this was, but there was a famous kind of brand of politics that was known as sewer socialism. And it was much more boring than kind of the Marxist revolutionary socialism you got in other countries. It was, labor affiliated parties in the US who called themselves socialist, but their big idea was, what if we manage the city correctly? And what if we build sewers and like public works?
Yeah, and the enemy of that impulse in the real world were the bosses, the political bosses and the robber barons who wanted to keep power for themselves. This was an effort by largely a middle class that was frustrated by the status quo to say, we're going to have experts with scientific expertise run things in a rational way that benefits everyone. And we're going to do that by investing power in centralized public institutions that are going to do good. That was the idea.
And this is very much in the same vein as like the whole movement of like scientific managerialism, that the idea that everything in society can kind of be managed and controlled by experts. This was very popular in the early 1900s, that like society is eventually just going to be managed by people with scientific knowledge, and the experts are going to control everything. And this was kind of part of that movement, right?
Taylorism, exactly right. You're exactly right. At the same time, within the same movement, adopted by many of the very same people, was a different idea. And it's not entirely clear to me that they saw this conflict in their own thinking. At the same time, many people saw the world as it was and thought to themselves, the problem is there's too much power at the top of society. The robber barons are too powerful. The political bosses and their machines are too powerful. And what we need to fix things is not to centralize power, but to push power down to ordinary people. So you see that in like the antitrust movement and Brandeisian thinking at the time. The core idea there was, yikes, there are these big corporations. They are making life difficult for small proprietors, and we're going to return power by using the tools of antitrust to return power to ordinary people, the people on Main Street, so that they're not overwhelmed with the power above them. So that I call a Jeffersonian impulse, and then it sits in the minds and the hearts of the same people who hold the Hamiltonian impulse. Those are two things that people are thinking to themselves simultaneously. We should move power up into blue ribbon commissions. That's a Hamiltonian impulse. And we should move power down into the hands of ordinary voters through public referenda, right? Those, when you look at histories of the progressive era, people give you this litany of ideas that the quote unquote progressives were for, and they include a whole potpourri of both Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian ideas. And the argument of my book is that that argument, that strange marriage of Hamiltonianism and Jeffersonianism, has existed within progressive thinking from then through today. And that the two ideas are in a sort of yin and yang balance. That you could be in one moment a little bit more Hamiltonian and a little less Jeffersonian, or the other way around. And that for the first 80 years or so of progressivism, right from the turn of the 20th century or before it until the late 60s, early 70s, the Hamiltonian impulse really prevailed in most cases. The sort of apex of this, in my view, is the Tennessee Valley Authority, where President Roosevelt gave this guy, a lawyer from Wisconsin named David Lilienthal, basically dictatorial powers in this region of the country, the Upper South, that's basically the size of England. And he was allowed to build dams and connect poor farms to the power grid, and to create, to re-landscape whole mountainsides, and to reforest whole areas, almost regardless of private property rights. And progressives loved this. Like, this was viewed as a huge progressive accomplishment, and it became, for a whole generation, sort of the apotheosis of what progressivism should be. Like the Marshall Plan.
Can I ask a question here? Because there's kind of this frame that I love to use, for certain issues. Like, I'll introduce it this way. The best economics professor I ever had structured his econ classes, like Econ 101 was something he would teach. And he basically structured it with four main sections. The first section was basically markets work. Here's what markets are and here's why they work. Here's that we know they do good things. And then the second section was, well, markets fail too. And so then the third section, after you learn about how market failure works, the third section was government works. And it's about how government actions can address market failure. And then the fourth section was government fails. And I always thought that was such an interesting way and such a valuable way to kind of frame the debate between state action and markets in economics. And I wonder if we could kind of apply a similar thing here that almost we could go through, Hamiltonianism worked. And we could, why did people believe in it in the first place? And then did Hamiltonianism begin to fail? And then was there a shift? Did Jeffersonian ideas work? And then did they begin to fail? So it sounds like what you're describing to me is kind of at the very beginning of this progressive era, from we'll identify their first real big power as kind of the FDR agenda. Was Hamiltonian thought actually working? Was it accomplishing what they wanted it to?
I mean, the short answer is yes, but it's more complex than that, right? Like there were the notion that big government bureaucracies could do big, great things felt right, beginning probably with the Wilson administration, right? Like the mobilization for the First World War, the creation of the Federal Reserve, and to a lesser degree, the Federal Trade Commission. Like these were a piece with, as you said earlier, the sort of notion that big corporations were more efficient, that we could do things using conveyor belts, right? That this is the period of Henry Ford creating very efficient modern corporations, and that the old way of doing business on the factory floor with a foreman was less efficient than sort of deconstructing the process, putting scientific experts at the top in control and running it from the top. That was a mind frame, sort of an ethos that prevailed. You're right, from the early era of progressivism through, I think, the 60s or 70s. And in many cases, it worked to great effect. It certainly wasn't perfect, right? There were all sorts of things that were wrong with it. David Lilienthal may have remade the Upper South, but there were horrible things about the Tennessee Valley Authority that progressives often looked past. The federal workers who were hired to do the work, for instance, were segregated in where they lived. Like it was a fundamentally racist institution. Those things are both true at the same time. And the other thing I'd say is that there was a Jeffersonian impulse throughout. It wasn't that the sort of the antitrust belief in empowering smallholder landowners and farmers was gone entirely for progressive thinking during that era. It's just that the Hamiltonian instinct really predominated over the Jeffersonian instinct for those decades.
So we had this era of essentially being able to accomplish big things with some caveats, right? Obviously, the Tennessee Valley Authority is a great example, but you could run through all sorts of stuff where, there was one of the examples I really loved in the book was that people don't realize how fast, like Franklin Roosevelt was able to spin up some of these things. He would give a speech saying, I'm going to start this new agency. And then 5 weeks later, there would be a new gigantic federal agency, and they would be doing the thing they said they would be doing. And then 14 months later, it would be gone. It would have built the thing it was supposed to have built, and the entire agency was just disbanded. And you probably know more than me about like the specific timelines of whether it's the Civilian Conservation Corps or whatever. But that era existed. And it kind of went through several decades. We were able to build the interstate highway system with very little fuss, and maybe some people were put off by their land being seized or whatever, but the Hamiltonians were in charge and they were just able to get it done. What happened that the national mood began to turn against it? I'll say both in the progressive movement itself, and I think the national mood overall, that both of those went in a direction where they began to distrust big agencies having that amount of kind of unchecked power.
Well, you're absolutely right to note that this wasn't some political move. There was a change in the culture that begins in the late 50s. It's probably best articulated then by the Beat poets and by C. Wright Mills. A begin to fear. It was at this point that people like C. Wright Mills and the Beat poets and others began to fear the power of centralized authority and began to see a quote-unquote power elite working its will not for the public benefit, but against the public benefit. It was the beginning of a real skepticism that these power brokers, that the people that had become what we now know as the establishment, were not actually publicly spirited or publicly minded, and that they were doing more.
And I notice you used the phrase power broker right there. I'm sure that's not an accident.
That's right. That in cities there was an establishment within cities that sat almost behind City Hall that made decisions about what should happen in the city. That something similar existed in the realm of foreign policy. There was the Georgetown set in Washington of the striped pants boys who sort of controlled American foreign policy. And in sort of all these different realms, the notion that an establishment existed, a Hamiltonian establishment of, at that point, men in gray suits and wearing fedoras and frowning and going to their important meetings and making decisions on the public's behalf, that became increasingly suspicious to a growing cohort of Americans. That they weren't so sure that these people had earned the right to make these decisions for everyone else. And that was a cultural shift that, as I said, began in the late 1950s and then really grows in a whole variety of ways during the 60s. In the early 60s, this group, Students for a Democratic Society, which is sort of the institution that backs the New Left, writes the Port Huron Statement during a retreat, and their articulation of what ailed the country was not that it was insufficiently organized or insufficiently productive in managing to change the landscape for the better. Their complaint was that there was a power elite that was imposing its will on an unwilling populace. And so increasingly at a cultural level, and the population generally, I guess, as well, begins to have second thoughts about the sort of notion that the problem is that we have a tragedy of the common that needs to be solved by institutions that sit above us.
Now, we're going to spend some time talking about how bad this whole impulse has been, and we're going to bash on the Jeffersonians, or maybe I will. I don't know if you'll join me. I will do some of that. But before we get there, I want to ask, did they have a point? Were they responding to like very real abuses? And are there things that you would say that like the Jeffersonian movement accomplished that were good ideas? And I want to give them their moment in the sun, because I do know that we're going to be at some point saying we've gone way too far in that direction. So, we should try to be fair and understand where they're coming from. When there was this generalized cultural distrust, Robert Moses is running amok and bulldozing neighborhoods and stuff. And And people are starting to be like, hey, shouldn't the people in the neighborhoods get a say whether or not their entire community is bulldozed? That seems reasonable to me. So I guess the question here is, what were they able to accomplish, and do you think that part of it was reasonable and needed in the context of what they were doing?
I think it's pretty hard to situate yourself in the mid to late 60s, or certainly the early 70s, and not say to yourself in that moment that the establishment had run amok, right? It's the establishment that had gotten us into the Vietnam War. It's the establishment that had done urban renewal, which was better known as slum clearance. It was the establishment that had established a interstate highway program that had, separated farms, been in many cases constructed in ways that destroyed whole neighborhoods of thriving cities, most famously depicted in The Power Broker. Robert Moses, rammed an expressway through the South Bronx, the Cross Bronx Expressway, which in the most famous chapter of that book, he blithely decides to run this expressway through a vibrant working class white neighborhood in the South Bronx called East Tremont. But that happened all over the place and was much more prevalent in black neighborhoods than in white neighborhoods. There was, as Ralph Nair would highlight, there was a collusion between so-called regulatory agencies and the people they were supposed to regulate. The regulators were quote unquote captured, so that in Nader's famous book Unsafe at Any Speed, the big car companies were putting on the roads vehicles that really were very dangerous unnecessarily. There was an environmental sort of an assault on the environment by various chemicals. That's the Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which comes out in the 60s. It highlights that. On all these realms, the thing that you see is that the old establishment, the old Hamiltonian establishment that had been erected to do good things, was doing bad things. Now, was it doing good things as well? Yeah, absolutely, right? There was housing going up. There were all sorts of sort of amazing accomplishments during this period of American life. But increasingly, the narrative about it focuses on the way that power had become unaccountable, that there was no way to hold these power brokers in check, that there was no way for someone who was just an ordinary citizen to have their voice heard by the establishment. And that in the absence of the establishment having to listen, terrible things were happening. So I think it's very hard. You and I can imagine how we would have stood on principle during that era and said, no, we need to have a balance between Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian impulses, and if everyone is able to say no to any project, nothing will ever get done. But at that time, the sort of the cultural correction was to clearly say those who hold power need to be held in check more. And like that just pervaded across the culture and in sort of every realm of American society. It meant new environmental regulations. It meant new checks on to protect historic buildings and endangered species, and to beautify the nation's highways, and to create new community boards so that communities could debate new housing projects. And you can just sort of see it in every realm of society. People are trying to erect new institutions that will check the establishment at every turn. And I think like that was a tidal wave of cultural sentiment, and it was warranted. Like the establishment had misbehaved. They had made a series of what turned out to be terrible decisions. We'll now talk about whether this counter-reaction went too far, but I do think it's fair to say particularly after Watergate, which is sort of the apex of the sort of the progressive awakening to the detriment of centralized power. That like this was a pervasive sense. This was Jeffersonianism coming to its level, and that there were lots of good things about that. The civil rights movement is a Jeffersonian movement in many ways to return to African Americans, particularly in the South, but in the North as well, the right to exercise their franchise, to have equal access to public facilities. The women's rights movement, like that is a progressive accomplishment that is not a Hamiltonian triumph, but a Jeffersonian triumph. So there are good things about this movement, and it was a cultural shift. But the thing that I think we progressives today don't see is the tension between Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian approaches to solving problems. And this was the moment where sort of the teeter-totter fell over its pivot. We had been a Hamiltonian movement, and we become an overwhelmingly Jeffersonian movement.
I really appreciate the need for that. And it's something I've written about before, that like you understand the environmental movement if you understand that, like, for several decades, the primary environmental problem was that like Cleveland's river was so polluted it would literally catch on fire. And I think that happened at least a dozen times. That wasn't like a single event. Like Cleveland's river regularly caught on fire. And that was kind of your median environmental problem. And so I understand the impulse. Well, like, environmentalism is when you ban things, and environmentalism is when you sue to stop a project from happening. And that's kind of how the environmental movement grew up. That's how they learned and built themselves, was that, we have to stop this factory, or we have to stop this plant, or we have to stop this company from producing chemicals. And it's just, it's the history of their movement. And it's a shame that it no longer seems like that's what they need to be built for. In today's world, environmentalism really involves building a lot of stuff very fast. We've got to build a lot more solar plants and wind farms and battery storage, manufacturing sites to pump out more batteries, and electrical transmission. And all of this means we have to go really, really fast and build things. And the environmental movement is sadly now built for the exact opposite. It's built to have expertise in suing projects and stopping them. And it's just the opposite of, at least what I think is the need for today's political moment.
Let me say something about that, because I think it's a terrific example. You've got in the 50s an industry or a manufacturing sector that is really, in the scheme of things, without any guardrails on the pollution that it emits, right? It can emit pollution into the air, into the water. That's a real public cost. The businesses that are doing the polluting are not paying for the cleanup. There's very little leverage that those who are worried about the landscape and the air can do. That's a classic public policy problem. And progressivism's two impulses could approach it in two different ways. One, as you said, in a Jeffersonian sense, you could give individual citizens the power to fight the polluters, right? To say, I'm going to sue you if I, as a public citizen, have a right. I have an interest in the environment where my kids go to school, where I live, the air that I breathe, the water that I drink, or that I'm from places where I swim. You're debasing the place where I live, and I, as an individual, am going to take you to court, and I am being given by the government the tools to force you to stop. Right? That is a policy approach. A second approach, a more Hamiltonian approach, would be to create a vast bureaucracy with the power to regulate the facilities that are emitting the pollution, and to say, I, as the Environmental Protection Commissioner, say you cannot have this much runoff. You cannot emit this much carbon. That you could, or whatever polluting chemical into the air. Those are two different public policy approaches, and I don't think that you need, as a progressive, to say that one is good and the other is bad. They probably both have their place. At the time in the 60s and 70s, the view was that the latter, which was to create a big public bureaucracy that would sort of make the call on whether the factory could emit any sort of pollution or how much it could emit or whatnot. The notion was that you couldn't trust that big public bureaucracy to do the right thing, that they were going to be captured, that the person who was making the call inside the public bureaucracy for the quote-unquote public interest was actually going to rubber stamp whatever the powerful industry executive asked them to do. And that was the core of the sort of Ralph Nader consumer movement, was that you can't trust the government. The government is, in a sense, in cahoots with industry. And so that really the only effective alternative is the first one that I mentioned, which is to empower individual citizens to have the ability to sue and create various mechanisms whereby outside interest groups, public interest groups, or even individuals can hold these big public bureaucracies and private industries to account. But it's not, right? It's this is a fight that the progressives had in the early 20th century, right? Theodore Roosevelt had wanted to create a big Bureau of Corporations to be a big sort of check on private bureaucracy. Others within the progressive movement had wanted to create a supercharged Sherman Antitrust Act so that we would break up big corporations, and right, the mechanism by which the people doing the bad thing are held to account, whether it's done by a publicly empowered regulator from the top or by individual citizens bringing suit. Those are two different approaches, and neither of them is good and bad. Like, they both have their advantages and their disadvantages, but I think too often we progressives don't distinguish between them. And the point that I'm trying to make in this book, and that you're helping me to sort of tease out here, is that right there at that moment when the Cuyahoga River was constantly, flaming up, and we were having an oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara, like in the early 70s, it would not have felt sufficient for many progressives at that time to say, oh, we'll just leave it to the Nixon administration's, Environmental Protection Agency and his appointees to do the right thing here. The idea was, we can't trust the bureaucracy that sent us to Vietnam and fought against civil rights and allowed the urban renewal to happen. Like, that the central bureaucracy was bad, and that the only way to really get a hold of this was to re-empower ordinary citizens to play a more direct and powerful role in the process of public decision-making.
What's interesting about that, and I don't want to get stuck here, but it struck me reading your book, one of the very good points that you make is that in the very early part of the 1900s, people would not have trusted the idea that, oh, well, we can just go to the courts and the courts will block these things that we want them to block, and they will be an avenue for us to get progressive policy decisions made. In the early 1900s, it was more of a reverse, where you had the progressives were largely in power, and they were trying to do big things. They were trying to establish aggressive agencies of government, and the courts were very conservative and would stop them from doing these things. And it's just very funny that we've now kind of flipped to, sometimes the government is overly conservative, I would say, and the courts are viewed as this progressive bastion of last resort that, the courts will get us to do what we want. And that flip is just funny. But one of the things that I think about when I think about the need to re-centralize power, that in my mind, I think you make a very convincing case that we've gone too far. That regardless, whatever the abuses were in the 1960s and whatever legitimate reasons the Jeffersonians have for, kind of throwing up roadblocks and empowering regular citizens to protest and to sue, that we've gone too far in that direction. But then I find myself saying, well, this book is releasing in the first month of the Donald Trump administration, in Trump 2.0, and we are seeing a breathtaking number of attempts from Trump to simply act what I would say in kind of a Hamiltonian way. In such a Hamiltonian way that he is essentially trying to seize powers that the executive may not legally have. He may be trying to, seize power from Congress and ignore the courts in kind of an Andrew Jackson sense. And so is that something you worry about, I guess, is my question, as we enter the second, presidency of Donald Trump. I look at this and I think, wow, what a terrible time to make the point that we need to centralize power.
I thought about it a lot. I considered bringing this book out before the election. And then I thought to myself, man, I don't want to be the progressive who released a book called Why Nothing Works months ahead of Joe Biden's, re-election. So we pushed it past and releasing it now in the February of 2025. You're exactly right that Trump's sort of central governing notion today is that he is the strong man that will push past the administrative state, the deep state, the bureaucracy, whatever it is, to finally have government deliver. And that I don't share his values or his agenda for the most part. So that seems lousy, and it makes you want to believe in the power of the courts again. The point I want to make with this book is that the approach that progressives took beginning in the 60s and 70s to really steer towards Jeffersonianism, to steer towards an effort to block big public bureaucracies from doing things, that entire approach, now 50 years later, has rendered government incompetent. We can't do lots of things. We can't build housing. We can't build better rail systems. We can't harness the power of clean energy. We can't, bring the middle of the country along. We can't find productive jobs and create a productive economy for the working class. All of these things are held back by a government that is essentially paralyzed by checks and balances. Those checks and balances that we created in the wake of the 1960s and 70s. We did that for good reason. We had good intentions. But a government that doesn't work is one that voters are going to reject. We're not delivering. Government can't deliver. And when government can't deliver, people look for alternatives. And that's what Trump is. Trump is a reaction to the impotence of public authority. And the promise of Trumpism, of MAGAism, is that he will get things moving again, that he's not going to be intimidated by all these environmental regulations and all these bureaucrats who are enforcing the environmental regulations. He's not going to be put off by the things that stop people sort of good conscience from doing things, who are willing to heed the demands of proceduralism. And my argument is, if progressives are going to win back the confidence of voters, government needs to be competent. And we are the ones that have erected the barriers to government competence. So we are the ones who need to deconstruct those. Not entirely. It's not that we want to go back to the age of the highway system and David Lilienthal and Robert Moses plowing across the South Bronx.
Actually, can I interject right there? I'm curious whether or not you actually had, because you talk to, in this book, you talk to dozens of different people, you interview people. I'm sure you're combing through the historical record. Did you get anybody in the book who kind of took you aside and said, don't put my name on this, but we actually do kind of need to go back to Robert Moses? I'm curious if like opinion has swung that far.
Um, Almost to a person, people look at me, talk to me, lower their voices, make sure that when they're talking to me, they're speaking quote unquote off the record, and say, we need another Robert Moses. Almost everyone in every industry. The people that want to build transmission lines connecting wind farms and solar farms to the grid. The people that, want to build high-speed rail trains so that people aren't in their cars polluting the skies. That, the people that want to build housing for working and middle class families. All of those people see the deluge of bureaucracy in front of them as they begin on any project or have any idea and think to themselves, I wish there was just some guy that could just push through all of this. When they say it, it's not that they believe that they want characters who have all of Moses's warts and, imperiousness and, some say, racism and worse. It's that they want to believe that there is someone somewhere in the system who has the discretion to give them the green light to do the thing they want to do. And that's that even more, this is where I sort of break a little bit from some of the conversation within the abundant supply side progressivism that builds movement, is that there's sort of an idea, here is how we would change the procedure so that we would get to yes more expeditiously. In many cases, those are good ideas. The real divide in my mind is between believing that there is some procedure that will get us to yes, that if only the people that had wanted to build the housing project had approached the community where the housing project was going to be earlier, that they could have figured out a way that everyone would be happy. I just don't think in many cases there's any way to make everyone happy.
Yeah, and that's a very tricky thing to say politically. And I find myself in agreement with you, but it's a delicate message to look people in the eye and say, you should not have so much of a say over this. And even when I believe that's true, like I live in New York and it's nobody can build housing here. The process to build housing in New York is nightmarishly complex. And I would be fine standing up in public and saying, all of you attending these community hearings, you should get less of a say, potentially almost no say. Like, you should not have your voices heard as much as they're being heard right now. I believe that. I'm not sure how to make it a winning political message, though,
Yes, and there's a long history of people who have used that as a message and have been quickly ushered out of office. You're absolutely right. I don't think that those people shouldn't have a say. I think they should have a say. I think they should have a powerful say. I think they should be able to voice their objections. I should think that they should be able to explain why they don't think the housing project theirs is appropriate, whether it doesn't adhere to the norms of the neighborhood, that it's too disruptive, that there isn't enough capacity for traffic to get those people in and out, that where will people park, all the objections that you hear. I also think that there needs to be someone who at the end of the day hears all of those objections and sees the New York region's need for housing and says, all right, in that case, I'm going to approve this housing project despite the objections of the neighbors, and I'm going to heed the neighbors' concerns in this place despite the demands of the larger regional community. What Robert Moses could do more than anything was to make those decisions by his own discretion, right? He chose where the highway went. He didn't have to listen to anyone. He just did it as he saw fit. We don't want to return to that. But we also can't have a system where all the people who objected to anything that Moses wanted to do were able to stop him at every turn. using a lawsuit, using concerns about an orchid species, using a concern about a historic building that's going to have to be modified, using a concern about the fish in the Hudson River. What we need, what government is supposed to provide, is some mechanism for balancing competing concerns. The thing I don't love about YIMBYism, though I'm in many cases very sympathetic to their cause, is that the notion is that if you own a property, you should be able to do what you want to do with that property completely regardless of your neighbors. In the end, maybe in most cases, that should be the case. If you buy a single family property in a neighborhood that is only single family homes and you want to turn it into a quadruplex on the same footprint, so that you've got 4 families living, I think probably in most cases, the presumption should be that you can do that. But rather than have a political program that says, by right, that's a very Jeffersonian notion, by right, you can do whatever you want with the housing you own. I think we ought to have some system where everyone's voices are heard and then someone is empowered to make a decision. The problem today isn't that voices aren't heard. It's that at the end of the process, if someone doesn't get their way, they take what should be a deliberative process into the courts. And suddenly the question becomes not, are the benefits of having a missing middle housing complex that can house whatever it is, 8 families on a lot that was zoned for 1. The question is not, is that good public policy? Does the region need the housing? Is the inconvenience to the existing neighborhood too great? Like, those are legit. All of those are legitimate concerns. The regional concern and the more neighborly concern. We should be able to balance those two things. What ends up happening is that if the study isn't done right, if the noise impacts haven't gotten sufficient due, the decision making is left to a judge rather than a policymaker, and the judge has to make their decision not on the basis of good public policy, but on the basis of some minutia of law.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
Did you follow the letter of the rule? And this is something I tell people about NEPA, for instance, that is one of the most baffling things about NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, is that NEPA, there's nothing in the statute, in the law of NEPA, that says a project must be good for the environment or that a project shall not harm the environment. All that NEPA says is that you have to accurately document what's going to happen. And back in the day, that could mean 20 pages of here's some things that we think. Now it's, typically 700, 800, 1,000 pages, and it takes several years to put together. But you could theoretically have a project where we want to nuke Miami. We think that'd be a great thing for the government to do. And that could theoretically pass NEPA review as long as you accurately documented all the things that nuclear weapons would do to the environment of South Florida. It is purely a documentary requirement, not a requirement that you actually help the environment.
And I'm not even sure that the requirement is that you document it. I think that it is the requirement that you discuss it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's the story of NEPA is crazy in the sense that it was liberals who wrote it with the notion that that NEPA was going to have no real impact on costs, that it was just going to simply make it so that when the engineers were designing the new highway through Minneapolis, that in the course of their discussion about what was the cheapest way to do it, which was their mandate to find, the most cost-effective way to, add some public capacity, that they also had a conversation in the course of that discussion about what the environmental impacts were. It did not say that they needed to heed that discussion or take it seriously. It was literally a law passed and President Nixon signed it, I think, New Year's Day, 1970. Just no one had any idea that it was going to have this impact. And what the genius sort of in the public, the genius in the public interest lawyer space realized was that they could establish standards in the courts to make sure that the discussion was properly complete, and that it encompassed all the various aspects, and that if the discussion wasn't sufficient, they could sue the agency for having failed to consider X, Y, or Z. So again, you're right. This gets very complicated and legalistic. But at the root, the issue is who gets to choose? Who decides we need more housing? Someone has an idea to put some of it here. These neighbors don't like it for X, Y, and Z reasons. These environmentalists don't like it for these X, Y, and Z reasons. What you want is someone with the power to weigh those things on the basis of public policy. What is best for the American public as a whole, or for the globe as a whole? And instead, what we have is sort of hand fighting over legal terms and whether the noise statute is properly accounted for, in ways that favor those who are opponents of change and that really get in the way of us being able to do big things.
If I can just summarize that, I would say, and I think you would agree with this, that the defining problem of government in this age is that there are an enormous number of people empowered to say no. The regular citizens and different commissions and different judges and legal avenues. And there's nobody at the end of the day who has the final authority to just say, yes, this is happening. And there's no more challenges. There's no more sorry, but it's done now. But we are coming up on time. So I want to kind of throw one more idea at you before we get out of here. The book, again, for everyone listening, is Why Nothing Works. I really enjoyed it. It's a fascinating book, both with the ideas and also the history. There's a lot of interesting history here. So pick up a copy if this is a topic you're interested in. The last thing that I want to talk about is kind of to get political for a little bit. Everybody's going to be scandalized that we get political here on the New Liberal podcast. But I want to return to the idea that, Donald Trump is in some sense our sins as liberals and progressives coming back to haunt us, that we built a government that's not capable of getting anything done. And so therefore a con man who comes in and says, the government never gets anything done, give me power instead. That's kind of what you get. And I think the shame of that is, we see stuff like Doge and the idea of Doge, which is, let's make government more efficient. Let's actually make the government work. In theory, that's such a good idea. And I would be so in favor of a properly executed Department of Government efficiency. But what is actually happening when conservatives and Republicans seize power because they are able to convince the American people that government doesn't work, they don't actually fix the problem of government not working. They're just going to cut a bunch of spending that they don't like. They're just going to cut foreign aid, and they're going to cut basic research spending. They're going to cut arts funding. They're going to probably end up cutting Social Security and Medicare, because that's the only way to really, impact the budget at the top level. They're basically going to give a bunch of tax cuts to the rich and cut Medicare, and that will be the, government reform that we get, rather than actually fixing the problem. And it's just a shame, is my reflection at the end of all of this, that, if Donald Trump is in some sense our fault from several decades ago, we've really got to fix the problem ourselves, because he's not going to do it for us.
Well, I agree with almost all of that. The thing that I would say is that progressives and Democrats are the party of government. And as the party of government, as opposed to the party of the private sector, it's our job to make sure that government works. If government doesn't work, we're selling a lousy product. And our focus for 50 years has been, how do we stop the government from doing things we don't want it to do? And we've been so focused on that, we've lost sight of the fact that government was also hampered from doing the things that it needed to do, that we wanted it to do. And so it's sort of, if there's any good news here, it's two parts. One is, Doge is popular, and at this moment in his administration, Trump is relatively popular because he is saying, we're going to do things. People want government to work. And he's promised to do that. That's something we should take away from it. But secondly, the good news here is we created this problem. We did this to ourselves. This wasn't a conspiracy from the right. It wasn't a conspiracy from corporate America. We had an ideology, which was, I am a progressive, and my job is to put guardrails around those who wield power. And the good news here is that we can change that. If we go back to our progressive roots at the beginning of the 20th century through most of the 20th century, we can see a movement that tried desperately to balance these two impulses, the Jeffersonian and the Hamiltonian impulse, in a productive way. We have gotten it wrong. We've steered too far to Hamiltonianism when Robert Moses was wielding too much power. We've steered too far towards Hamiltonianism now. But if we get the balance right, something that we can do on our own regardless of what Trump says and does, if we can get that right, we have a real claim to the public support. I think that people want that. And it's work that we can do on our own without simply screaming about how terrible Trump is. If we make government work, if we have a legitimate agenda that appears to balance, the need to do big things with the voices of those who will have to give things up in order to give society these big accomplishments, that's something that will have popular support.
Well, I certainly hope we are able to make that happen. It seems like we are going to see a lot of chaos from the Trump administration, but nobody's in power forever. Democrats, liberals, progressives will at some point seize the reins of power again. And I hope by that point we will have learned this lesson pretty well. I want to thank my guest one more time for coming on, the author of Why Nothing Works, Marc Dunkelman. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. Fun to talk about it.
Absolutely.